Martin, on the big issues of the week, I think we'll probably start just with Hong Kong, because we've seen another big change this week where the Chinese Beijing government are going to be vetting all the candidates that are allowed to stand in Hong Kong from now on. And we're going to be hearing from Peter Ford with his views on it in a minute. But the people of Hong Kong seem to have been kind of sold down the river, really, by Chris Patten back in 1987, although I suppose we didn't have much of a choice, really.
Well, the Chinese government's position, as you know, is that, there never was a democratic structure inside Hong Kong, and they took it over as what they perceived to be a going concern oligarchy. And that's their attitude, rightly or wrongly. And the balance of forces, as you rightly point out, is such that it's virtually impossible for anybody to change their minds if they don't want to change it. Of course, the real political significance for Britain is that up to 3 million Hong Kong Chinese could become citizens of this country, which will be very interesting if we're in the middle of a major recession with mass unemployment.
OK, so anyway, let's have a listen to the former British ambassador to Syria, Peter Ford, who I spoke to yesterday. He had quite a lot to say about what's going on over in China. I'm just having a look to see if I can find out whereabouts that is, because his attitude, anyway, maybe it's not one of the clips that I've got ready, but I think his attitude, Martin, is basically, well, it's there's nothing really we can do. And the other thing is, he's saying that we have made things worse by encouraging these demonstrations that were taking place with millions of Hong Kongers coming out onto the streets.
Well, I mean, as a former ambassador, he's basically telling people the inside gen about this. Western intelligence services have worked very hard to stir up people in Hong Kong. And, they're basically prepared to fight to the last Hong Konger. Their goal is to cause embarrassment and difficulty for the Chinese regime. And in that they have succeeded. But whether that was in the best interests of Hong Kong is another question. I would argue it was in the best interests of Hong Kong to push for the maximum autonomy possible within the structure of power that the Chinese regime represents. That would have been, basically in their interests. But pushing for things like total independence was obviously going to be a red rag to a bull to the Chinese regime. And of course, what happens is ultimately they've put their foot down and said, well, you're not having that. So, and of course, in the past, they were willing to kind of negotiate and hum and ha about things. And now they said, well, any concessions we make, you just demand more. And we're just going to put our foot down and you're not going to have anything.
Yeah, well, I know you're quite a supporter of the Chinese way of doing things.
No, I'm not, Tony. I'm just telling you that Peter Ford is a former British diplomat, and he's telling you how it actually works. It's all very well saying I'm a supporter of the regime. I'm not. I'm just telling you, we're not going to war with China over Hong Kong. We're just not going to do it.
You're probably right. But anyway, the actual way that people are being treated in China is pretty appalling in terms of the surveillance. Although, of course, that surveillance does go on here, as we pointed out last week, with the whole blacklisting of usually union activists, but also environmental activists, anybody that's basically an activist. It seems like we're dealing with a complete and utter control freakery, both in the West and over there. It's a little bit more subtle over here, a bit more, in a way, the West is more like Brave New World and China is like 1984, Martin. Is that a reasonable comparison?
No, I think it's actually both the West and China are far more complicated than using simple analogies suggest. China today, for example, is very different from the China of 20 years ago, and in many respects a more open society than it was then.
Well, it isn't for the Uyghurs, is it? Obviously.
Well, all right, but I mean, but compared to the Cultural Revolution, you had a Uyghur representative on last week, and they were saying, well, during the Cultural Revolution, we really were under the cosh, and then things eased up a bit. And of course, after Tiananmen Square, they went back down again. And now, of course, with an ongoing confrontation between the West and China, the Chinese hardliners are in the ascendant for sure, because we've got people in the White House and in Dominic Raab basically saying we want to overthrow the regime in China.
So you're
the Chinese just say, well, no, you're not going to do that.
West for the authoritarianism of the Chinese government.
I didn't quite catch that, Tony. Sorry.
Are you blaming the West for the reason that China is so authoritarian?
The relationship between China and the West was gradually improving, but once 9/11 happened and all the rest of it, we've got basically an illegitimate criminal regime in the West based around 9/11, and they basically want to take out the opposition all around the world, the Russians and the Chinese. The Russians have got a democratic system, more democratic than the United States of America, if I may say. And, of course, in Syria, they had an election in 2014, which we've completely ignored. And Peter Ford, of course, who I hope we're going to hear from, he was the British ambassador in Syria before that. The real world isn't just about goodies and baddies, right and wrong, authoritarian regime. There's an authoritarian regime in Saudi Arabia, which is carrying out the biggest genocide on the planet as we speak, fully supported by RAF personnel. The Chinese just shrug their shoulders and say, you don't know what you're talking about. Why pick on us? What about what you're doing?
Well, I suppose the reason they're picking on them is because of Hong Kong, and also because they're a far, far more populous, greater power. But anyway, let's have a listen to Peter Ford now. And it is this week 10 years since the beginning of the Syrian civil war. So I asked him about that and, really, I suppose, about the war itself.
It was planned beforehand by an unholy alliance of the Western powers that had been preparing from Jordan, south to the south, preparing jihadi forces, and on the other side you had the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been active in Syria for many years and which was just waiting for an opportune moment, which came along with the Arab Spring, and they saw how the Western powers had overcome Gaddafi, and so the jihadi people in Syria thought it was an opportune time. They got some civilians to start a demonstration. The Syrian security forces overreacted a bit, and that was then lighting the blue touch paper. Then you got the agent provocateur, the snipers firing into a crowd, and the whole thing just took off like gunpowder.
Okay. So what about today? Where are we now?
The situation's stagnant. There's a military standoff. Assad controls 70% of the country. There are only two big pockets in the north and northeast that are not under Assad's control. One is under the control of Al-Qaeda, effectively Idlib, supported by the West. And the other is actually occupied by American forces acting in cahoots with some Kurdish militia forces. And unfortunately, that area happens to be where Syria's oil is and where most of its grain is. So they're depriving the rest of Syria of very important resources, and along with sanctions, that is causing very, very severe hardship in Syria. It's very hard to see how this logjam can be broken. There's a military stalemate, and I would predict that it's going to look much the same in a year's time.
So this is it's not the first time this sort of thing has happened in the Middle East. We seem to be seeing a kind of balkanization going on. In fact, this has been happening over many, probably at least a century or more, that these borders are being redrawn. So do you think these new borders are stalemate? Will eventually form borders of new nations of some sort?
Well, there's a very definite risk of that. I'm reminded of Cyprus, where the Turks have been ineffective control of northern Cyprus since about 1975, and that's supposed to be temporary. But the Turks, the same Turks, are in control of Idlib and a sliver of territory along that northern border of Syria. So that and putting down roots, introducing Turkish currency, post offices, schools. So yeah, we're seeing the de facto partitioning of Syria, and with the Americans controlling the northeast, it's not a good prospect.
Well, look, I'm sure the Turks would say it is a good prospect. They look back to over 100 years ago when this region was part of the Ottoman Empire, controlled from Istanbul.
That's right. In fact, all the countries in the present-day Middle East are artificial, the result of a carve-up when the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1918. And we and the French, and then later on the Americans, came along to carve out respective spheres of influence. And we created the country of Syria, and the country of Lebanon, the country of Iraq, the territory of Palestine. Most of it was what they called Bilad al-Sham, the country of Syria. It was all Greater Syria, but over 100 years we've been seeing a dismemberment of Greater Syria, and what's happening today is the next and possibly final step towards the dismemberment of Syria at the hands of the great powers.
Well, this obviously benefits Turkey. Are there any other powers in the Middle East that this benefits? Well,
Iran stands in the way of this dismemberment, and this is where there's some cause for hope. Iran has done a great job fighting ISIS and helping Assad to resist regime change at the hands of the West. And Iran should not be underestimated.
Okay, so that's the former British ambassador to Syria, Peter Ford, there speaking to me yesterday. Martin, he's really there saying that the chunks of Syria that are still left, the Turks and the Americans, it's quite amazing, isn't it, that we've got the Americans supporting Al-Qaeda and Iran fighting ISIS. One wonders which side we're really on.
Well, I don't think there's much doubt which side we're really on. We're on the side of Al-Qaeda, as we were in the 1980s in Afghanistan. Incidentally, something that has happened this week, which is worthy of note, is that has been a massive attack, missile attack, on the oil production facilities, which are controlled by the Kurdish faction in alliance with the United States in northern Syria. They've been basically stealing the oil. As Trump said, we're going to stay to keep the oil. And they've been taking oil out of there and selling it on the black market and using it to finance their attempts to keep control of it and so on. But the Russians, it seems, without making much of a song and dance about it, have basically blown up all the facilities in which this oil is being kept in order to be sold onto the black market. And basically, they're basically saying, if we can't have this oil, we're not going to let you have it. And the other thing that may happen soon is that the Syrian army will close in on the Idlib pocket and drive everybody in. They'll leave the border to Turkey open so that they can flee over the border. And of course, lots of Uyghurs are inside the Idlib pocket. They've been trained and armed now by the Turks. And of course, what the Chinese are worried about is they're going to end up back in Xinjiang province killing Chinese soldiers, because that's the long-term plan that Erdogan has.
The British jihadis that MI5 have let back here, but they won't let Shamima Begum back?
Well, that's right. I mean, we covered that last week. I mean, Peter Ford, I have to say, has been exemplary in his analysis of all of this. He was the former British ambassador to Syria. He knows what he's talking about, and he knows that we have been supporting jihadi terrorism in Syria.
Well, one of the other things you said, and Martin, there's a longer interview here, which I'll put up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. I'll put the complete interview with Peter up on there tonight, and you can download that and have a listen. But one of the things he says is he was actually saying how sad it is that Trump is no longer around, because one of the things he was doing in Syria was doing everything he could to pull the US troops out of Syria. And yet he was then finding that he'd issued twice different orders to pull the troops out, only to be undermined and countermanded by the Pentagon.
Well, that's right. And if Biden isn't going to do that, but even if he wanted to, he wouldn't be allowed to. And of course, what Trump famously said is, well, we'll stay and keep the oil. But what the Russians have done, with presumably in consultation with the Syrians, is, we're not going to let you have that oil. Basically, they've said they've wiped out the possibility of using that oil to finance further insurgency, and ultimately, of course, when they've captured the Idlib pocket, they're going to drive everybody. They're going to take control of every inch of the country. And of course, Assad has also said we're then going to go and take the Golan Heights.
Isn't this what the Western intelligence forces do, though? They seem to go in, grab the resources, whether they be oil, grain, cocaine, and then use them to fund black projects.
Yes, I mean, that's their modus operandi. The other thing, of course, is the other week Biden attacked the border post between Iraq and Syria. It was actually on the Iraqi side of the border that he attacked, and he killed Iraqi militia forces, quite a lot of them, who were actually part of the Iraqi armed forces. Now, what we could easily happen here, and I think other things I've been reading this week are very worrying about developments in the Ukraine, is that we're going to have all of these wars are now, now Biden is in control. Trump basically wasn't a team player as far as the deep state were concerned. I mean, but he was a reckless person in any case. I mean, he was the one who ordered Soleimani assassinated, no doubt, on the orders of the people giving him orders. And of course, the Israelis, who've probably got an election coming up soon, are very, very keen to have an all-out war on Iran. And of course, that is the sort of thing that Dominic Raab and Boris Johnson are going to have to think about, and Keir Starmer too.
So the Pope has been visiting Iraqi Christians this week, victims, according to antiwar.com, of US foreign policy. The Iraqi Christians, the victims of US foreign policy.
Well, very much so, because in the Saddam regime, repressive and horrible as it was, he was an equal opportunity repressor. And basically, the more extreme elements in each of these communities there were very much held in check by the Ba'athist setup. And the Christians, who are a very significant minority in Iraq and have been for many years, they have been driven out or killed by the non-Christian factions. But I think it is significant that Sistani, who is the lead, in many ways the religious leader of Shia in Iraq, met with the Pope, and there must have been all sorts of negotiations about that. And Sistani is, in fact, a voice of reason in Iraq in many respects. When the Paul Bremer and the occupation authority said, well, we don't need to have any elections around here, we'll just run it, Sistani said, no, you're not doing that. We're going to have an election here. And of course, there has been a vote in the Iraqi Houses of Parliament that all foreign forces should leave forthwith. That is to say, US forces. But they haven't gone. And that means, of course, war. Of course it does. What else can it mean?
OK, well, actually, they are saying that, also on antiwar.com, that if the US forces leave, that they won't be attacked. They're promising them, if you leave your bases, we will let you leave without attacking you, which I suppose is the least that the Americans can expect, having brought such misery with the British and Tony Blair to that whole region. But anyway, Martin, a little bit of good news, I suppose. We've got countries now pushing back against US sanctions at the United Nations. The Trump administration left many countries under crippling sanctions that are still in place. China, Russia, North Korea, Iran and other countries, 16 altogether. I'll run through a list of the rest, which is Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, Algeria, Angola, Belarus, Bolivia, Eritrea, Laos, Nicaragua, Cambodia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines. All of these places are under US sanctions, and they're saying, well, look, to the UN, we've had enough of this.
Yeah, I mean, all of these sanctions have no basis in international law. It's only the UN which is allowed, in theory, to put sanctions on a country, as sanctions were put on South Africa.
Of course, it's also economic warfare, isn't it? This is economic warfare.
It is, and of course, people die in economic warfare. At one stage, when there was a sort of eyeball-to-eyeball negotiation going on with the Argentinians about their international debt, the Americans said to them, "What do you think would happen to a country when they couldn't get insulin for their diabetics? So you better just cave in and do what we want." That's how they do business. But there's no basis in international law for any of that. And of course, the Americans talk about a rules-based system. What they mean is our rules, and we don't even obey the rules that we set. The International Criminal Court, for example, has decided that it is going to look into Israeli human rights abuses in the occupied territories, but the Americans are already saying that this is unfair to Israel and that therefore that it shouldn't go ahead. They're just not interested in playing by the rules.
The International Criminal Court seems to me like a bit of a bad joke. It only seems to criticise and arrest ethnic minority black African leaders. There's none of the Bushes and Blairs going through that international court. It's just another branch of the modern version of colonialism. But look, when I spoke to Peter Ford, he mentioned, didn't he, just now, about Bashar Assad and Asma Assad, the ruling couple in the country. And I thought it was quite interesting because he said, well, actually, they are pretty much like British people. They're very much, and he knew them, obviously got to know them as ambassador quite well. So I just asked him, what were they like, Bashar Assad and his wife?
Bashar studied to be an eye doctor in London, and during his studies he met Asma, who's the daughter of a Syrian origin Harley Street surgeon, and she was a trainee banker herself. If you met her, you might even think she was English. She even looks like the traditional English Rose, and she has a completely English accent.
Almost like a kind of English. If the British were behind the Civil War and behind the ruling party, well, isn't this a British problem? We often think about this as an American thing, Martin, but the Brits were definitely involved there, weren't they?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the British created, Syria and Iraq, and the Americans weren't directly involved in that. But then, of course, they've subsequently become the dominant players, and the Israelis, of course, constantly aggrandizing their position.
Also, I did speak to Peter about Russophobia, because Russia is really the only reason that country didn't slip away. There's all sorts of reasons why the Russians didn't want to see Syria fall. I think they realised that if that happened, that they were going to lose their Tartus base on the Mediterranean. But anyway, let's have a listen to what Peter had to say about Russophobia now.
Russia had the impertinence to want to have some sway in the Middle East, wanted to have one country, just one country, Syria, that wasn't under the thumb of the Western powers, because we've got all the other bases covered. Syria is absolutely surrounded. There is not a country in the Middle East except Syria, and of course Iran, but among Arab countries, not a country which is able to say no to America. And we could not tolerate not having the full monopoly board. Russia could not be allowed to have one country where it had more say than ourselves.
So have the Russians, do you think, successfully blocked that move, pretty much indefinitely now?
Well, the Russians have played their hand very cleverly. They're much smarter than we are. They think in much more strategic terms. Their language is always more polite than ours, but they're more calculating, and they know where their own real interests lie. We just have prejudices and obsessions.
Prejudices and obsessions, Martin. I mean, he's really saying there that as a diplomat, he felt that he was part of almost like a losing team, that the Russians were way more professional.
I think any objective observer would recognise that. I mean, look at the gyrations of policy there's been around Syria in the US, with the British just following along as the usual lapdog they are. And, presumably when he was in post as a professional diplomat, they would be advising the politicians of things. But the politicians in the West are, overgrown kids, and they continually change policy, according to whims and prejudices. But underlying all of that is the will to power, the will to dominate, the idea that Fukuyama put in his book, The End of History, that everybody is going to become like the British and the Americans in the long run, and they've just got to get used to the idea. And of course, the real world really isn't like that. And it's been a tragedy what's happened in Syria, totally unnecessary tragedy, which has caused millions of people to suffer extraordinary terror and misery. And it's actually funded by our taxes. And of course, we then want to go home and have a nice cup of tea and pretend it's nothing to do with us.
Also, on antiwar.com, Israel are updating their plans to attack Iran, Martin. Ready to act independently now, apparently. The Israeli Defense Minister Benny Gantz has told Fox News in an interview published just about a week ago that the Israeli military is updating all its plans to strike Iran's nuclear program and is prepared to act independently. He portrayed Iran's recent steps to advance its civilian nuclear program as the Islamic Republic racing to develop the bomb.
Well, there's no real change there. They've been agitating for a war on Iran for a very long time. And of course, we've still got all of these debates going on in Britain about who is and who is not an anti-Semite, which is just cover for a drive to war, a war which quite possibly is going to lead to the end of the world. But nevertheless, we've got plenty of Meghan Markle to talk about.
Well, you're going to love this because Peter Ford has some pretty strong views on what's going on with the royal family as well, Martin. But anyway, before we leave Israel, the United States, we just hear today, and Israel are holding their first strategic meeting on Iran, and that the Israelis Israel apparently has been attacking oil tankers since 2019, Iranian ones.
Yeah, well, also they assassinated that nuclear scientist, if you remember, and they continue to carry out sabotage operations of every kind inside Iran. Incidentally, just slightly off topic, the Americans have flagged up that they're going to carry out a cyber attack on Russia because they believe that Russia were behind this solar winds cyber attack inside the US, and they flagged it up and said we're going to carry out an cyber attack on Russia. Now, cyber attacks are illegal, but they've flagged up that they're going to carry one out.
Yeah, but they're acts of war as well.
Well, they are acts of war. And of course, what will happen at some point, if you keep provoking people, the Russians are preparing for war. The Iranians.
What with all our smartphones,
because there's quite likely going to be one.
What with all our smart meters and our glorious Internet of Things, which is being pushed by Bristol City Council and the rest of them, the usual suspects. What we're getting is we're getting incredibly vulnerable, aren't we? Things like our electricity supplies, the electrical power stations, our cars, our trains, all of our anything networks which are now dependent on computers are vulnerable to being destroyed in some sort of cyber attack, basically, at the very least, disabled completely.
Yeah, well, the Russians have been saying, well, why don't we get some conventions agreed about not doing any of those things? But the Stuxnet virus was the Israelis and the Americans openly boast, and no doubt the British were involved as well, caused all kinds of problems at Natanz for the Iranians, and then set off to poison computers all over the world, and may even have had something to do with what happened at Fukushima. The West is out of control. The deep state in the West is a war state, and they're basically gearing up for a confrontation, not just with minor powers, but with the two other major powers, China and Russia. And we're possibly going to have, we discussed in previous weeks COVID and whether it was a biological warfare attack on China or not. I'm quite certain that the Iranians, the Chinese and the Russians presume they're going to be attacked. And of course, they're going to wait. They're not just going to. They don't do what the West does, which is send signals. That what they will do is when they retaliate, it will be overwhelming, and they will do it by surprise.
Well, my main beef with the whole Meghan Markle story. Sorry, Martin, you can switch off if you want, but we're going to. Peter Ford has got something to say about it all. Is that she offed her first husband of 2 years, Trevor Engelson. Then she offed her father, Thomas. Then she offed her brother, Thomas Markle Jr., and our sister, Samantha Markle, who's published a book, The Diary of Princess Pushy's Sister, all about her. Meghan then went off the royal family too. Not to kill them, obviously, which is another word, but all I'm saying is that she just blanked them and she doesn't want anything to do with them. Maybe she doesn't like families. She's raised allegations about racism, mental health, passports and princes. And also, she seems to be trying to look like brave insider Princess Diana. Maybe, though, there's ulterior motives. I asked Peter Ford about this, whether he's a royalist or a Republican, and whether the events over the last week or so have changed his mind on that.
The Americans have an alternative royalty. It's called Hollywood. And Meghan kind of straddles the two rather interestingly. They have their Hollywood princesses and princes, and the Americans obsess about them just as we do about about royalty. But the Americans got rid of the British royalty 2.5 centuries ago. They've not been anxious to reinvent that institution, though, as you mentioned, they do love their dynasties as well, their political dynasties, the Kennedys, the Clintons, the Rockefellers, etc. So yeah, they also have a sort of instinct for it, but they've not brought back a monarchy.
What about the central allegation, really, in the Oprah Winfrey interview, which is related to racism and the idea that a young prince is not going to be called a prince? Would he actually get the chance to be called a prince? We don't know. And the idea that maybe it was going to be determined on his skin colour, that was the allegation anyway. Do you think that holds any water?
I think it's rather pathetic that anyone should be so attached to having their offspring be a prince. If Harry had any guts, he would have given up his title and become a Republican. That would have been interesting. But he's a nice chap. I like the way he came over in the interview, I must say. But I don't have much time for any of them. But that said, if you're going to have princes and princesses, then it's not fair that one should be excluded because they might be coffee colour.
But, I mean, are the royal family racists, Peter?
I had no idea. I haven't. I had actually met members of the royal family, but I've not discussed race with them. I got descended on by Prince Andrew when I was ambassador. That was a dreadful experience. You wouldn't want to be descended on by Andrew, and even worse, the courtiers, the staff. They are dreadful, snobbish, bossy, unbelievable, and living in not just in the last century, but 3 centuries ago in their attitudes. It wouldn't surprise me in the least that the courtiers were really racist.
What was it like being descended on by Andrew then? What happened?
Well, at the time, Andrew was supposed to be promoting British exports, so he came with a delegation of business people, and he was just so patronizing. He literally at one point patted me on the head. Unbelievable. I'm not a big fan. You probably sense that.
Okay, well, anyway, there's some big changes over in the States, allegedly. I mean, one does wonder, really, whether a change of president really means much of a change of policy. Sometimes it seems it doesn't. But what do you make of the new Biden administration? Do you think there'll be any changes internationally? I mean, obviously, the US, most of the American citizens will be voting on domestic policies, but the whole world is watching. What is this creature going to do next, America?
Well, American policy never changes much. Trump, bless his soul, tried very hard to change it. Twice he ordered the withdrawal of American forces from Syria, and twice he was countermanded by the real powers that be in America, the arms industry, the Pentagon, the security honchos, the diplomatic panjandrums, the Washington establishment, the Beltway, or the Blob, as some call it. And the Blob will continue to call the shots on American policy. Biden doesn't strike me as having the fiber of a man or the brain of a man who is going to shake things up. So the branding will be a bit different. We'll hear more about human rights and all that nonsense, but there'll be no important changes of policy.
Well, it sounds like all that American election, Martin, was a complete waste of time.
Well, I mean, this is the problem, isn't it? The election is essentially a distraction, because whoever wins, the really serious policies are already decided. The selection of the candidates is fixed, and that's why Trump was so annoying for them, because he came from left. You know, when I say left field, he came from outfield, and he wasn't an insider. But ultimately, whatever he thought he was doing, he wasn't going to be allowed to do it. And Biden, of course, is very much the insider's insider, and it's not even going to cross his mind to rebel against what those people want. What's going to be very challenging is when Biden backs the Israelis on a war on Iran. Boris Johnson will no doubt go along with it, as will Dominic Raab. And we might even see Keir Starmer going along with it on the basis that Biden's in favour of it and Biden's one of the good guys. And, of course, that really will bring home the splits that are developing in the Labour Party between what I would call the pro-war faction and the genuinely anti-imperialist left in the party.
Okay, well, so let's have a look now, move over to look a bit at the COVID pandemic or plandemic, depending on your party view on that. And we had some clips last week of an interview with Dr. Stanley Laham from Florida University, a long interview with him I did last week, which is up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk from last week, and I'll put it up again tonight. So much. He seems like an absolute goldmine of information. And one of the things he talked about we didn't have time for last week is this whole idea of using pandemics for biological warfare. So let's have a listen to that now.
The European population was more adapted to fight flu through natural selection in Europe, just like the Europeans who came to America had a better selective natural selection for smallpox than the indigenous population, and they tried to wipe out the indigenous population, of America with smallpox. They would give them as gift, sheets, clothing and cloth and stuff that from people who had died of smallpox. And as you know, the smallpox virus survives. It was a form of, biological warfare that was used against the American indigenous population. And sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally. For example, when the Spaniards came to Hispaniola, they brought diseases, but the Arawak Indians, what they call the Arawak Tainos, their immune system, these diseases did not exist in the Americas. Therefore, you did not have natural selection for a population that was resistant or had the capability to fight off those diseases.
Yeah, Stanley Laham there, talking about biological warfare in the Americas, Martin. This is actually quite well known. It should really be kind of prompting at least some of our news media, which, I mean, you probably find it's only online this is really going on much, to be questioning about whether this is biological warfare, this pandemic.
Well, I mean, obviously, in previous weeks, we've covered this at great length. The fundamental difference is there's a book called The Great Divide, which is about the difference between civilization in the Americas and in Eurasia. And what the really big difference that made a huge difference when the two civilizations met after 1492 was that in Eurasia, we'd had farm animals for thousands and thousands of years, all sorts of farm animals, and lots of diseases had come from those animals into the human population. And of course, they'd caused all sorts of pandemics. During the lockdown last year, I was reading loads of stuff about all of this. And it may well be that agriculture was invented with livestock was invented quite a few times in Eurasia. But of course, the problem with it was that it was rife with disease. But ultimately, of course, it became a successful setup where people, for example, developed lactose tolerance so that they could drink milk even as adults, and so on. And it became a very successful way of doing things.
I thought actually diseases thrived. Martin, I thought that diseases thrived. One of the ways that they thrived was through mass urbanisation and that sort of thing that was going on in Eurasia.
Yes, that's right. But you had urbanisation in the Maya, the Mexica, the Incas had urban civilization, but they didn't have farm animals apart from llamas. And that meant that they didn't have any immunity to the diseases that came from.
Well, that's a bit of a shame because llamas are very antisocial creatures.
That's right. Because they're antisocial creatures, they were hardly used for anything. So they didn't really have much of an interaction with them. So even if they had developed diseases from llamas, there's possibly some llama diseases that they were exposed to, but that didn't help them at all.
But I mean, one of the main points that Stanley's making,
and sheep and goats.
One of the main points I think was really fascinating that Stanley's making in this, which you can download from last week's show page or this week's tonight, is he's talking about the extent to which immunity is passed down through generations through the mother, both through genetics, in other words, so that your immune system is adapting over long periods of time and natural selection to actually being able to cope with certain types of diseases and not others, but also a fascinating conversation with him, which gets a bit technical, which is why I'm not using it tonight, about the extent to which a mother actually passes immunity from antigens and blood cells on through the placenta into the child. So there's all sorts of important things here where, inherited immunity through natural selection and also through genetics through antigens passed into the child. But of course, the problem is, as he goes into in great depth, is the different blood groups. So, you've got potentially a mother with one blood group and a child, an embryo with a different blood group. So there has to be a big separation between the two. But the point he's making really here, Martin, is that if you work with the body's immune system, say, for example, you're using something like ivermectin to give the body's immune system a chance to fight off COVID-19, or if you're allowing someone to catch it and also develop a mild version or whatever so that they can then fight it off into the future, that is potentially carried on to future generations. Whereas if you have a vaccine, that doesn't pass on to any future generations at all. It's only for the one person.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because I have, in fact, been vaccinated this week with AstraZeneca vaccine. Well, I mean, there are wider scientific questions about vaccination, immune systems, and so on. And then there's the big question, which you began this section, is this biological warfare? And I suspect that some people know whether it is or it isn't. We certainly heard the Murdoch press and others pushing the idea that it was definitely the Chinese, that's why they call it the Chinese virus and all the rest of it. And I suspect rather to the opposite, that it is in fact a biological warfare attack on China.
This is just not accurate. I mean, the Murdoch press, as you call it, Fox News, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, was actually pushing that this was a US virus actually manufactured in Wuhan.
Well, that is very interesting. The work done by that journalist, which we've covered in previous weeks, is very interesting. But that's not the main line that was being taken by the Murdoch press in Australia, for example. They were basically just trying to pin it on the Chinese. I mean, of course, they're trying to suggest that it's incompetence by the Chinese and in their laboratory.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, things have moved on. Martin,
they were pursuing things that were actually based in the US, as you said.
In the last month or 6 weeks, things have moved on with Steve Hilton and the Next Revolution program, really taking things on quite a long way. Yeah. And other parts of the Murdoch empire have been reporting that, although rather sceptical, I think, is sceptical about it, but at least reporting it. It's incredible to see Murdoch doing this as somebody I've been a great disliker of for decades, and I'm sure most of our listeners have. It's incredible to see Murdoch doing that. But anyway, look, let's have a listen now again to another clip from Stanley Laham. And this is really looking at a very serious topic, and that is that whether the protocols that have been being devised by our government health departments, both in the US, in Britain and elsewhere, these protocols have been preventing doctors from actually treating patients properly and ultimately killing people. So these faulty protocols, and, he and I were discussing at the end of the interview, we have to find out who's written these protocols if it means that potentially tens of thousands of people have died because of those protocols, and that the pandemic has been made far, far worse because the wrong protocols for treatment have been prescribed for doctors within the National Health Service, for example, that they have to do. And he was saying, as you're just about to hear, how it is basically in a situation where he as a doctor is diagnosing somebody, they go into hospital, he loses control of the patient, and then they die. So have these protocols being used in our hospitals been killing patients? Let's have a listen to that now from Stanley.
Across the world, a lot of people are using ivermectin. For example, I know of 4 countries that put it in their protocol to treat SARS-CoV-2, and they have very low mortality, very, very low mortality.
So which countries are those?
All right. El Salvador, Honduras, India has started the same, distributing ivermectin. By the way, preventatively, as a preventive, because it's a comparatively very cheap drug compared to remdesivir. Not quite as cheap as chloroquine, but close. The Dominican Republic, and now Haiti. The first country that I was aware of that was using remdesivir as national policy was Honduras. Then came El Salvador, and I'm sure there are others that I don't know about.
I mean, so how can it be that something which is a cheap, well, it's not a cure, but it's certainly, there's statistics are around 75% recovery rates, up a bit, some a bit more, some a bit less, using ivermectin. How come Haiti has got it right and Europe and the United States have got it wrong?
It's very funny. Money, it has to be with money. The American public, I don't know if it's the same in England, but the American public is the most exploited as far as the health industry is concerned. It's because remdesivir cost, the cost of treatment of remdesivir is about $12,000 in hospital. That's what your insurance company, or you personally, if you don't have insurance, or if you're old enough that your Medicare has to pay for. And do you know how they justified it? Do you know how Dr. Fauci, Anthony Fauci, justified that cost? Not because the cost of production is high, but because they say, according to their research, it reduces hospital stay by 3 days. Look at the original publication on why remdesivir was recommended. It reduces hospital stay by 3 to 4 days, which I don't think it has, but they say it has. It hasn't saved lives, obviously. Those who were critically ill, we wouldn't have that high of mortality among hospital patients. And they said $12,000 is less than 3 or 4 additional days in hospital in the US. And I have my cousin's brother, well, he's my cousin through marriage, who died here at Baptist Hospital after 3 weeks on respirator and remdesivir. And that's why I told my, and this was back in July. And that's why 2 months ago, when my friend here, I told her, do not go to the doctor. You go to the hospital. Once you're in, I cannot tell you what to take. And I remember when my cousin's brother was in hospital, we were talking to his wife, and whenever she would call the hospital, she was not allowed in back in July. People were in total isolation, and they would tell her that we're following CDC recommendation. And I'll never forget, the week before he died, 3 days before he died, they said they think he's doing better. 3 days later, he was dead. And he had a full course of remdesivir to the cost of $12,000.
Now, that's a lot of money, isn't it? And cousin's brother is dead, Martin. So some of these protocols seem to be being drawn up by the drug companies.
Well, I think it's pretty obvious that the Western setup, particularly in the United States of America, is completely corrupt.
But hang on, we've been using the same here. It doesn't, Martin. We've been using the same sort of protocols here, haven't we?
Yeah, but I mean, the US is a worse. I mean, the public health system in the US is by many times worse than the one we have here. But what's happened with the NHS is it's been run down and undermined in all sorts of different ways, but it's still a fundamentally much better organised system in principle than what happens in the US. And that doesn't really matter, does it?
It doesn't matter who's paying for it in a way, whether it's the patient that dies because of a bad protocol or the government that pays for the patient here that dies under a bad protocol. It's the protocol that's the problem and the pharmaceutical lobby that's drawing it up.
Well, I agree, but the pharmaceutical lobby has a great deal of too much power in this country, but it's got even more power in the United States of America, and that's fundamental.
Well, yes,
the vaccine rollout in Britain has been relatively successful because it's been run by the NHS. And that's because the NHS, despite being run down, is quite an efficient system for doing stuff like that.
Well, it also may be, Martin, because people trust the NHS more. I noticed the vaccines haven't gone down too well in France. There's been quite a lot of people. They say they're vaccine hesitant. Well, I'm not vaccine hesitant. I'm vaccine intelligent. I don't think I need a vaccine, partly because I believe I've already had COVID-19. And secondly, because I think that the other sorts of treatments that Stanley's recommending, the antiviral treatments, which allow you to build up some resistance to it and not die, and also to pass that resistance on potentially to future generations if you're a woman, that's a better way of dealing with things. But anyway, let's have a listen to Stanley again. And he's explaining here how he believes we're paying the price. The public is paying the price for this pandemic in two different ways.
Well, that's regrettable. It's regrettable that we're in such a state of affairs. And I think the public is paying the price two ways. First of all, financially, because the public money that's being paid to these companies, the billions for their vaccines, is from our tax money. And second, we're paying with it with our lives, because some of these, ivermectin could have saved perhaps thousands of lives.
At much less of the cost as well. He also, Martin, I want to ask you to pay attention, particularly this time, because he completely disagrees with you when it comes to lockdowns. He thinks that the lockdowns are proven to be a disaster. So it'd be interesting to see what you've got to say after our final clip from Dr. Stanley Laham, who's a retired immunologist. He seems to, I actually joked with him saying, well, it's like you're taking us on a trip of the immune system, a bit like the Fantastic Voyage, the film where these people get miniaturized and stuck inside someone's body, and they're kind of seeing all the corpuscles, the white blood cells, the red blood cells. He does that for me. He's given me a fantastic insight into what's going on with the immune system. But here he is, and we'll let you have what you have to say about lockdowns afterwards, Martin, where he says that the lockdowns are proven to be a total disaster.
Well, this is perhaps, to me, the biggest mistake in combating the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. COVID-19, anybody who says, well, we did the best we could and we're successful, is inherently wrong, because look what it has done. Look how many shutdowns, look how, for a coronavirus that has a mortality rate of 1% at most. And the reason for that is that we've been concentrating, one of the reasons for that, we've been concentrating on protocols that seem to be effective against all other viruses, except those that the coronavirus for which they were designed. Supposedly that's why we're not seeing all the flu epidemics or pandemics, because these measures were effective against the flu, but not against the corona for which they were designed. So that's a failure. And second, we've been concentrating on vaccines for a virus that's presenting mutations with antigenic structures that do not cross-react. So that a vaccine, we might get an antigenic variant of the coronavirus for which the vaccine you receive is only 20% effective. There is cross-reaction, but very little. So what we should, I think, have concentrated on as much as vaccines, which nobody has funded, I have heard of no government funding for it, is on antiviral drugs. Something that would keep the coronavirus from replicating. Now, it so happened that we found out that a drug that was, first elaborated in 1975 by a Japanese scientist called ivermectin is very effective in inhibiting the replication of the coronavirus in vitro, that is, in tissue cultures, and in people, in vivo. I told you that my friends were, two of them that were, and that got for sure infection with SARS-CoV-2, did very well with ivermectin supplemented with an antibiotic and high doses of course, vitamin C and vitamin D, which is also as important. And there's a history of finding antiviral drugs, by accident. One of the best is, for example, the simple amino acid L-lysine against all types of herpes virus, from herpes type 1 causing fever blisters to herpes simplex 2 causing genital herpes or mononucleosis for example, we found that L-lysine, a simple amino acid, inhibits the growth of herpes viruses. Just like we found that hydrochloroquine inhibits, to a certain extent, the replication of the coronavirus. So does ivermectin. We found drugs that inhibit the retroviruses, which I mentioned before, things like actinomycin D, rifampin, AZT. We could have concentrated on finding simple molecules that inhibit the coronavirus. Now, the one antiviral that was heralded as effective and that made Gilead Pharmaceuticals close to $10 billion, and the chief executives who promptly sold a lot of their shares to personally make a lot of money, was remdesivir.
So there he is, Martin. He's saying, look, it's made $10 billion getting this on the protocol. But also the more important point is that the lockdowns, this whole system of lockdowns has really not stopped SARS-CoV-2, but it has stopped flu. So he's saying that the lockdown protocols, or whatever they're doing with the lockdowns, has simply failed.
Well, I think you've got to unpack various aspects of this. I'm totally willing to accept that there may well be cheaper antiviral drugs which have not been looked at because of the overweening power of the pharmaceutical companies. I'm not going to get into it. I don't know enough about ivermectin. It may be so that, as he says, he's a doctor. I'm willing to listen to what he's got to say. Now, what he said about lockdowns, the countries which lock down early and hard have no COVID, virtually none. And that's nothing to do with ivermectin or vaccines or anything. They used straightforward administrative measures, track and trace. They squeeze the virus out, and their economies, and I'm talking particularly about the Chinese economy, is going to be the only economy last year in growth. And that, of course, is when we're dealing with World War III, as we were discussing in an earlier part of the programme. That means that the Western powers, with what they've done, they've allowed this to happen because there's lots of disaster capitalism, because that's the way the West is organised. But it may well be that the deep state in the West wanted COVID to be a disaster in the way that it is, so that they could bring in the Great Reset and all the rest of it. The problem with that is that the Chinese have checkmated them. And, of course, that's what World War III is going to be about.
OK, so the former Syrian ambassador, Peter Ford, I also spoke to him about what he made of the lockdown policies to do with the COVID-19 hysteria or pandemic, depending on how you see it. So let's have a listen now to our final clip with Peter Ford, after just hearing our last clip with Dr. Stanley Laham. Peter Ford now on what he makes of these COVID lockdowns.
Well, I'm utterly opposed to lockdown. I think as a strategy, it's absolutely disproportionate, and it doesn't even work. I was tempted to describe myself as a lockdown skeptic, but in my case, it's a lot deeper than skepticism. It's outright opposition. I have been on demonstrations, on marches in London, Liverpool, Manchester. I have fought the good fight on this issue, risking arrest several times, and still campaigning very vigorously. I'm utterly opposed to lockdown. I think the curtailment of our liberties is absolutely shocking. Even Mao Zedong would have been shocked by how far we've gone controlling even intimate family behavior, that you need the permission of a policeman to go 2 miles down the road and have a coffee. Unbelievable and unforgivable. I'm particularly struck by the obsession of our masters with so-called models. They don't want to look at the real world, as you mentioned, the examples of Sweden, Florida, South Dakota, Belarusia, several countries in the developing world, including Syria. Almost everywhere has done better than us. We've had the most strict lockdown, and we've suffered most in terms of fatalities and in terms of the dreadful damage to our economies and jobs.
That's the final clip from Peter Ford, Martin. He's as he says, he's not a skeptic. He's in absolute opposition to lockdowns.
Well, I don't agree. I think the Chinese have got it right. I think the Vietnamese have got it right. I think the New Zealanders have got it right. And they're not using vaccines or ivermectin, and their economies are growing. What happened here is that they took their eye off the ball and they were worried about other things, mentioning Brexit again. So,
do you think it's okay to, I mean, this has a sort of zero COVID policy. I mean, it's not going to work, is it, if the whole world doesn't adopt it, this zero COVID policy? It may be that there's very little, if any, COVID flying around in places like New Zealand. But unless the whole world does that, it's surely pointless. At some point, someone is going to come to New Zealand and the whole thing is going to start over again, isn't it? Or China or wherever.
Well, what's actually happening is a Southeast Asian bloc is developing before our eyes of zero COVID states. And they are going to be the winners in the 21st century, provided they're not prevented from winning by a war directed at them. And, of course, it may well be that this is a biological warfare attack on China, which has massively backfired. But the economic impact is quite clear. Nobody is going to be allowed into China, New Zealand, Vietnam or Taiwan, any of these countries, unless they are COVID-free. And that means either having a vaccine or having been vaccinated. And this is going to go on and on and on and on, because we're moving into a wartime economy now. That's where we're at. And the banking system is on the verge of collapse. The stock market at some point will go down, and the countries which are well organised will manage. And the countries like this one, where in Britain, where we're run by incompetents and fools by any definition, we are going to do very badly.
As regards to lockdown, there's going to be some relaxing of the rules. Saturday, 13th of March. Martin, are you going to be taking advantage of them, or are you going to be locking yourself down?
Well, I'm prepared to go along with whatever is agreed, and everybody, and you know what the general policy is. As I say, I've had my first vaccination. I've got another one in some months' time, but I'm going to work anyway. I'm working in schools and, in theory, possibly being exposed. It's a bit.
What's the testing regime for people working in schools like you?
Well, I mean, in January, we were being tested. The staff were being tested once a week. In the school I'm in now, there is no testing going on, but there's quite a lot of restrictions still in place, and you know, I'm becoming an elderly gentleman, and I've got high blood pressure, and I potentially would be in a risk category. So when the opportunity to get a vaccine came up, and of course this is the AstraZeneca vaccine, it could have been the Pfizer vaccine, which I'm much more cautious about. And of course that has been produced at cost, as has the Sputnik vaccine, as has the Cuban vaccine, as has the Chinese vaccine. None of them produced by Western pharmaceutical companies.
You've got to have a second jab, have you?
You've got, you know what they did when they were developing the AstraZeneca vaccine in Oxford University. They discovered by accident that in actual fact, you give people 2 jabs rather than 1. It's actually with a smaller dose each time. It's more effective than just 1 dose. So that's why they're doing it like that. And of course, originally you were supposed to have the second vaccine dose 3 weeks after the first, but because they didn't have enough doses, they're now going on for the 12-week. It'll be some weeks away before you get a second dose, and I'm not particularly keen on it, but I just thought, well, there isn't really much of an option. And of course, what will happen, it's quite clear that if things like Glastonbury go ahead, then they're going to have everybody with vaccine passports, otherwise they won't be allowed to go ahead. That's probably what will happen.
Well, news just come through today about your vaccine, Martin, unfortunately. It's to do with blood clot reports in Europe prompt an investigation into the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. The jab has been suspended because of reports of blood clots in vaccinated Italy. I think it's just one batch of them, though. I'm not absolutely sure. Thailand is also delaying the AstraZeneca rollout after the European countries have suspended that vaccine over these deaths due to blood clot fears. And here in the UK, we've also got questions about that too. The regulator says it's safe, but in other parts of the world, Denmark and Norway and Iceland have all temporarily halted the use of all AstraZeneca vaccinations to investigate reports of blood clots amongst people who've had the jab.
Well, countries like Iceland, which are COVID-free through using lockdown, they can take their time to decide whether they want to use a vaccine. The reason it's been rushed out here is because they've made so many mistakes, lockdowns that didn't work because they were too late, lifted too early, eat out to spread out, that the vaccine is really they've bet the farm on that. And if it transpires that the vaccine, but the real danger with it probably is that it's not going to work. And they're not using it in South Africa either because it doesn't work on the South African variant. And of course, if the South African variant is brought back into the US, all the people have been vaccinated, it'll be no good anyway.
Well, I'll tell you what does work on the South African variant, ivermectin. So despite the ban, they say UK's Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the MHRA, said there's no evidence to suggest AstraZeneca vaccine is the cause of the blood clots. Are you confident in this MHRA?
Well, I'm not. I've had the AstraZeneca one, not the Pfizer one. So the Pfizer one is more problematic because it's much more expensive.
Well, we know that from past weeks, but this week there seems to be some big questions about the vaccine you've had, Martin.
Oh yeah, well I mean they've rushed these vaccines through because they don't want to look at other alternatives. If you suggested ivermectin, I'm not hostile to people talking about stuff like that. If that's the case, then let's hear about it. But what gets me about people who are, if you like, critical of the policies that have been pursued is that it's a rag bag of stuff. Lockdown clearly has worked in some countries and not in others, especially where it hasn't been properly pursued. Why argue about face masks? It seems to me that's a secondary issue altogether.
There's an obvious flaw in what you're saying is that if lockdowns have worked, how come we've had to keep redoing them time and time again for a whole year?
Because they haven't done them properly, Tony. We didn't lock down till too late. Then we released too early. We did it again. We've done it 3 times. Eventually, you learn through your mistakes or you don't learn. In countries where they got on with it properly, a proper test and trace system, like in China, unlike Dido Harding wasting £37 billion pounds, then they've managed to do it. What this has been is a really, really acid test of the way in which countries are organised and how well organised they are or are not. The Southeast Asians have come out with flying colours. The neoliberal West, including Western and Eastern Europe and Russia, to be fair, have come out very badly. And it's pretty clear who's done it right and who's done it wrong.
Well, I think, okay. I mean, for what it's worth, I think that you're wrong on that because there's been also successful non-lockdown countries. So the worst thing you can do is to actually vacillate and do a bit of one and a bit of the other, which is what you're right. The British have done and the Americans have done. But anyway, we're going to move on now to look at Adam Curtis. Now, I know you mentioned this to me a few weeks ago, this new series. I've just been looking at it, and I think that I'm really disappointed in this documentary. I always look forward to thinking, well, at least there's somebody producing decent documentaries which are going out, being produced by the BBC these days. But this is an absolutely appalling film. What it does is it looks at the JFK conspiracy theories as the sort of root of all evil. And yeah, as we know, this is almost like the CIA commissioned this documentary from Adam Curtis. What is because as you and I know, it was the CIA themselves that came out with this term conspiracy theory in order to squash any proper investigation of the JFK assassination in the years after that, in the mid and late 1960s. This was their term that they would use to smear anybody that was getting close to finding the truth about what had happened to JFK. So what do you make of this whole idea of the conspiracy theory? And because it seems to be one of those little expressions that is a meme that's going around the whole of the Western media. And basically conspiracy theorists are painted as mad people, where actually what they're doing, what we're doing, is trying to get to the truth.
Well, as you say, the term conspiracy theory is used in the mainstream media, originated in the 1960s in the United States. It was CIA's term, because up to that point, the theories about the assassination of JFK were called assassination theories. And one of the things that the psychological warfare people in the CIA decided to do was to use the term conspiracy theory to cover these things. Now, I watched the whole. It's a very long series of films that he's made. They're over an hour long, and each of them about an hour and a half, and there's 6 of them. So I watched them all, and what I found about it is there's lots of detail in there which I don't agree with. And there's loads of stuff that's not in there, which I would imagine ought to have been in there. So in many respects, it's actually a bit of a curate's egg of a series. But what he has done, and I think which is worth watching if you're interested, is he's got access to the BBC archive, and there's loads of really interesting archive footage in there of all sorts of different things from all over the world, which very rarely gets seen.
No, but he's
put them all together. Yeah, and whatever you think of his overall thesis, the clips themselves are intrinsically interesting.
Well, I mean, it seems to me perfect Orwellian stuff. He's been given access to the BBC archives in order to try and turn history on its head. But let's have a listen now to the first clip from this. We've got a couple of short clips, luckily not the sort of whatever it is, 12 hours or something you're describing, Martin. And the first one is from the first episode, where he starts getting into how terrible it is to question the JFK assassination.
Kerry Thornley had left California and gone to live in New Orleans, where he worked in a bar. The movement that he and his friend Greg Hill had started, Discordianism, was beginning to grow, spreading by word of mouth. Like much of the new counterculture, it was against all politics. It distrusted all the old systems of power, left and right, because they were just trying to force you into their version of reality. Thornley also published his novel, with Lee Harvey Oswald as the central figure. It was called The Idle Warriors. But New Orleans was also the city where Lee Harvey Oswald had lived before the Kennedy assassination. And as a result, Thornley came to the notice of the man who was going to be the main creator of the JFK conspiracy theory. He was the district attorney of New Orleans, called Jim Garrison. Garrison said that Oswald had just been part of a giant conspiracy that included the CIA, big business, the news media, and anti-Castro Cubans, who together had killed the president.
There's no question about that. There was a conspiracy. A number of men were involved. An apparatus which was lethal in nature, of which Lee Harvey Oswald was a part, assigned a role essentially as decoy. Now, don't ask me what the organization is, because I can't say.
But the implication clearly is the Central Intelligence Agency, your own security organization in the United States.
It almost sounds like that, doesn't it? I have no comment about that.
Jim Garrison believed that the modern democratic system in America was just a facade, that behind it was another secret system of power that really controlled the country. But you could never discover it through normal means, because it was so deeply hidden. Garrison wrote a memo to his staff, explaining how you could uncover this secret world. He called it time and propinquity. You didn't bother with meaning or with logic, he said, because that will always be hidden. Instead, you look for patterns, strange coincidences and links that may seem to have no meaning, but are actually telltale signs on the surface of the hidden system of power underneath. This theory was going to have a very powerful effect in the future, because it would lead to a profound shift in how many people understood the world. Because what it said was that in a dark world of hidden power, you couldn't expect everything to make sense. That it was pointless to try and understand the meaning of why something happened, because that would always be hidden from you. What you looked for were the patterns. And when Garrison read Kerry Thornley's novel, he saw a pattern. Not only had Thornley been in the Marines with Oswald and written a novel about him, but he had come to live in the same city that Oswald had lived in before the assassination. And in 1967, Garrison accused Thornley of being part of the conspiracy. Thornley was furious. He knew that Garrison was wrong. But he also hated the very idea of conspiracy theories. He believed that they were one of the ways those in power controlled you. Conspiracy theories made you believe that there were hidden forces that really controlled the world. And that made you as an individual feel weak and powerless. Suspicion, he believed, was just another form of control.
Well, suspicion is another form of control. So he was saying you shouldn't be suspecting that there was a secret system there. It's interesting. I think that Adam Curtis runs through these various parts of the system that Jim Garrison was suggesting were behind the Kennedy assassination. The CIA, big business, particularly the Texas oil barons, the mass media, the news media, he calls it there, and the anti-Castro Cubans. Well, as we know, this is exactly who was behind the Kennedy assassination. It certainly wasn't the Russians who, with the idea of having Oswald as the shooter, the idea was to try and pin it on the Russians, Martin.
Yeah, I mean, I think what the thing about Adam Curtis is that what he does is he goes into all sorts of stuff that the mainstream, by and large, ignores. And he's one of the few people who's allowed to do it. But, I mean, if you compare what he's done to what Frankovich did with his documentaries for the Time Watch series about Gladio, is that it's all Curtis is very interested in what you might call sociology of conspiracy and why people believe conspiracies. I mean, in other parts of the films, he says, well, of course there are conspiracies. The Americans have been involved in overthrowing democratic governments, etc., etc. But in other words,
but not their own.
What he is he's a limited hangout merchant. That's what he is. He raises all the questions.
Okay, but what do you make?
And also the tone of voice he adopts there. It's like it's not quite as bad as the conspiracy files, but we're getting there. And
yeah,
that's presumably, as you say,
getting very close. Actually, I mean, he's done some terrific stuff in the past. The Century of the Self, the Power of Nightmares, for example. It's just a pity to see him selling out in this way. But he talks about the Discordians there. Who are these guys?
Well, the guy who they're the ones who pushed this idea, Robert Anton Wilson and the Illuminati novel trilogy and so on. So he thinks that the main fault I would put on Adam Curtis is he sees everything as to do with mind control and people's minds. And in actual fact, a lot of conspiracy is actually physical stuff. It's shooting people, it's poisoning people and stuff like this. He's always interested in the way in which people perceive things. And that, of course, there's a lot of visual richness in the films because he's got all of this archive footage that he's obviously spent a long time editing together. But he's also, I get rather irritated by his tone of voice. Because it's almost.
But it depends what he's saying.
He can explain everything, and everybody else is stupid. And of course, a lot of detail is just wrong.
He's always had that style. He's veered, as you say, towards this kind of conspiracy files. It seems like he wants to kind of pick and choose his conspiracies. Some exist, some don't. The secret system, if you want, the hidden government, the parallel government, the secret government. But he seems to pick on the wrong ones to discredit. But anyway,
he just doesn't take conspiracy seriously enough.
Yeah.
What he does is he says, you've got the people over here who believe 9/11 was a conspiracy. You've got people over here that believe that Trump, that Trump was working with the Russians. He thinks that's a load of nonsense. And of course, he presents himself as somebody who's not taken in by any of this. We all know that all these conspiracies are wrong, apart from the ones which are right. But of course, he doesn't specify those, apart from the ones that we know about anyway.
So the CIA go around, fixing governments, killing, assassinating, but they would never ever think and dream of doing it to JFK. I mean, it's just not credible. But anyway, let's have a listen to the second and final clip, a short one now, about the Discordians, a bit more about them and Robert Anton Wilson.
He and Greg Hill began by placing a false letter in the Playboy letters page. Thornley's fake letter asked whether all the political assassinations in America were really being masterminded by a single secret society, and the society it named was the Illuminati. It said that the Illuminati were behind all the chaos and the fear that was now gripping America. He and the other Discordians then proceeded to spread this idea all across America through the counterculture, in magazines and books, and even in plays. Thornley's aim was to try and break the spell of conspiracy theories by making people see the absurdity of believing them. And he had chosen the Illuminati for the experiment because no one could possibly believe that an 18th century organisation from Bavaria was really, in the second half of the 20th century, the secret rulers of the modern world. It was clearly ridiculous.
Or was it? These secret societies can sometimes continue for long periods of time. And I thought we'd have a listen, Martin, to a clip with Alistair Milne and Duncan Campbell from the 1980s. These two got together. Duncan Campbell did a series for the BBC called Secret Society. It was looking at the incredible amount of secrecy that does go on in Britain. And of course, the hint in the background is to do with things like the Illuminati or Freemasonry, using this term secret society to describe what goes on in the UK. There were two major programmes as part of that series which were banned, not by the BBC itself, but through the Board of Governors by the government and by the Ministry of Defence. One of them was about secret cabinet committees, saying that a lot of the decisions that were being made by the government were completely away from any kind of scrutiny, made by appointees. Important decisions like whether or not to have a Trident nuclear submarine replacement was being made by a secret society within the cabinet, or an offshoot of the cabinet. The other one was about the Zircon spy satellite and how vast amounts of money were being spent on a spy satellite, and tactics had been used by the Ministry of Defence in order to make sure that there was no understanding or scrutiny of that through Parliament. So very successful attempts, particularly to do with things which might be regarded as militarily sensitive, to make sure that not a single parliamentarian had any access to those decisions, that they were basically being made in secret. So let's have a listen to this now. This is the Secret Society series that Duncan Campbell produced and presented for the BBC in the 1980s. And here is Duncan talking about the way he was sacked by the BBC, the Director General, Alistair Milne, was, because of this series. And of course, this, for anyone that understands these things, marked really the beginning of the end of the BBC as an independent force. It's now controlled by the City of London through appointees to the chairman of the Board of Governors from the city, from big city institutions, as if they would make any good at running a journalistic organisation. They're just there to make sure that their criminal activities in the City of London don't get investigated. And the Director Generals that we have now, equally appalling. For example, I mean, probably the last decent one was Greg Dyke, But they're now, Tim Davey, the most recent Director General, is one of the marketing people from PepsiCo. So we're really getting an absolute monstrosity taking over, with the City of London criminals chairing the BBC and the marketing people from Pepsi making all the editorial decisions day to day. So let's have a listen to this discussion from the 1980s with between Duncan Campbell, the investigative journalist behind the Secret Society series, and the Director General of the BBC, Alistair Milne, the father of Seamus Milne, who was the Jeremy Corbyn's press secretary, who was Director General at the time, who commissioned that series and was then sacked in 1987.
Cabinet wasn't the first programme in the Secret Society series to suffer this fate. When the contents of another episode, Zircon, were revealed, the results were rather more dramatic.
Once inside, the detectives began a lengthy search.
The Zircon programme had revealed the secret plan for Britain to launch its own spy satellite. Special branch searched my house, looking for evidence of a leak. The New Statesman magazine published the Zircon story. Its turn came next. The police search lasted 5 days. The BBC's Scottish headquarters in Glasgow were next on the list. The special branch were ordered to remove every tape, film, script and scrap of paper for secret society. Despite a month of extensive police activity, most of the BBC's films and tapes were soon returned. 9 months later, it was announced that there would be no charges over the Zircon affair. The Zircon film itself was returned to the BBC at the end of 1987 and transmitted a year later. There was no outcry. But the Cabinet programme has never been seen on television until tonight. So what was the fuss about?
I didn't think it was a brilliant piece of work, but it contained some very good things. I saw nothing wrong with it in terms of transmission.
But okay to go out in the air?
Absolutely, no problem, yeah.
Secret Society brought to a head a long-running row between the BBC governors and Alistair Milne. They didn't like being under fire from the government, and they didn't like the kind of people Milne was letting work for the BBC.
One of them described you as a destroyer, and there was a lot of worrying and huffing and puffing, particularly when Hussey arrived. I was determined that if we were going to have a showdown with the board again after Real Lives, that it wouldn't just be one voice, but all the editorial power that we could bring to bear in it.
You'd written to the governors to say you'd approved 5 and put 1 aside, and then this was announced. And then something rather catastrophic happened.
The next board meeting on January the 29th, there was a bit more huffing and puffing about Secret Society, but the decision had been made. As far as I was concerned, it had anyway. But at the end of that board meeting, I was called in by the chairman and the vice chairman and told that I was to leave immediately. And so I left the BBC that very day on the 29th of January 1987, while the special branch were just about to launch their attack on Broadcasting House in Glasgow.
In your autobiography, you talk about being hounded by the governors in your last weeks in the BBC. What was going on?
The governors, as I say, a number of them disapproved of the BBC hiring you anyway. They were extremely tense about the possible outcome of the individual programmes. They raised the issue at every board meeting till I went. And they were pretty grumpy about the whole thing. Hounding is, I think, a fair description. Over a period of time, the governors had been appointed from a particular spectrum of the political world.
The spectrum being?
The ruling Conservative Party.
It had nothing to do with me. It's only a matter for the BBC.
Did he resign because of political pressure, Mrs. Thatcher?
No, only a matter for the BBC.
But Mrs. Thatcher didn't seem unhappy about the peremptory manner in which the governors had disposed of their Director General.
I was furious. I mean, apart from the fact it was a very considerable shock, I was just very, very angry because I don't believe people should be treated like that. And there must be better and more elegant ways of parting company than simply being called in and thrown out in your ear, no?
So that's the voice of the late Alistair Milne, who's Director General of the BBC in 1987, who was booted out for this Secret Society series, Martin.
Yeah, I mean, that is what I would call bona fide, 100% conspiracy theory about specific things, specific people, specific, focused journalistic investigation. General theories about generalities of the control by, the political system by a secret society descended from the 18th century. Well, I've got much less time for that sort of argument, full stop.
Yeah, but the point really I'm trying to make here, I suppose, is that it's we've come a long way down the road from 1987. That decision to remove Alistair Milne has had enormous consequences, leaving us now with a system which is completely in the hands of commercial big business and the City of London.
Yeah, well, it's going to be interesting to see how things develop going forward. The BBC quite clearly is, insofar as it's got any independence left at all, they're in many respects pursuing the government's line on various things. And of course, at the same time, we've got Murdoch's going to bring in his version, some other TV station, and Andrew Neil also is talking of doing the same. We're going to move to a more US-style system where the commercial interests of big business will be dominant, and the public sphere that the BBC at its best has represented will be consistently marginalised and undermined.
Yeah, and journalism will be dead. Anyway, so we're going to look finally now at the go-betweens for Hitler, and that is because of the Meghan Markle interview. I know how much you love this story, Martin, but I thought rather than look at that, we'd look at the parallels with the abdication scandal back in 1936. Just looking at the timeline of this, I think is fascinating because you've got to see the whole thing in context. What happened with Edward and Mrs Simpson? You had King Edward VIII, who'd only just taken over from King George V. And all of a sudden, he was out on his ear. Basically, the guy was a very enthusiastic pro-Nazi. And, of course, that wasn't really going to work. A bit embarrassing in the run-up to World War II. Almost embarrassing as it was in World War I, that the royal family had to change their name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor in order to, I suppose, con the British people into thinking that they weren't Germans. There's a bit of embarrassment there. And the fact that the First World War really was just a family squabble between three cousins who fell out. That is to say, Kaiser Wilhelm, King George V, and the Tsar Nicholas, who were all cousins, fell out and caused the First World War. But anyway, so the incredible stuff that Karina Urbach has brought out in her 2015 book, which is called Go-Betweens for Hitler, is pretty fascinating. But we're try and set it in context tonight here, because it was in January 1936 that King George V died and Edward VIII came to the throne. Then, later that year, in December 1936, Edward VIII abdicated and became the Duke of Windsor, with running off with Mrs Simpson. There was a big crisis. She was a divorcee, and supposedly, due to the law, she wasn't allowed to marry the king. Well, that has happened with Prince Charles, of course, and actually people have questioned whether Charles and Camilla's marriage is actually legal, because the law states that the royal family have got to have different basic rules about whether they can be married to divorcees or not than the rest of us. And then the next year, in June 1937, Edward married Mrs Simpson, who'd managed to get her divorce properly through over in France. In October 1937, the Duke of Windsor did a tour of Nazi Germany, organised by a guy who's a fascinating person in this book, Go-Betweens for Hitler, called Charlie Coburg. And he seems to be a sort of almost Desmond Morton, Martin Bormann-style character for the royals, making sure that there are connections continuing between the Nazis and the top of the British establishment. So that's October 1937, as the Duke of Windsor with Mrs Simpson does a tour of Nazi Germany, with all, of course, the marvellous publicity that there is here for Germany, which comes as a result. Then, on the 10th of May 1940, Churchill becomes Prime Minister after the war started the previous year. In 1939, Churchill becomes Prime Minister. Although he was a Liberal for 20 years around the time of World War I, Winston Churchill takes over as Prime Minister. And the war is it's called the Phony War. It starts kicking along. And then on the 18th of June, just a month or so later, Winston Churchill does their finest hour speech, which we heard last week, about the future of Christian civilization, perverted science, amazing speech, really. And then literally a week later, the Duke, Edward VIII, the Duke of Windsor, he was over in Spain and he talks to the German diplomats there, and he tells them, you need to bomb Britain in order to get them to the negotiating table. So, unbelievably, Edward VIII is the person who's responsible for triggering the beginning of the bombing of Britain on the 25th of June, 1940. So we're going to continue this timeline after we've heard a clip from Karina Urbach talking about her book, Go-Betweens for Hitler. And she starts off by talking a bit about Charlie Coburg, but obviously the main subject of her discussion here for a couple of minutes is Edward VIII.
Charlie Coburg puts pressure on them. He is a back channel to them, but he's also playing both sides because he's still a back channel to the other men. He still works with the Duke of Windsor. He still organizes the Duke of Windsor's trip to Germany. He makes sure that the Duke of Windsor meets Hitler, and he plays both kings, really. He's very clever about that. And that the Duke of Windsor was guilty, I think we can all agree on. I was very lucky because one of the quotes I found in the Franco papers that had been overlooked up till then shows absolutely convincingly that the Duke of Windsor was a traitor to his own country. The quote is interesting because he was talking to a Spanish diplomat, a friend of his, who immediately reported all of these conversations to Franco. And he says to the Spanish diplomat, on 25th of June 1940, the war is on, Churchill is in power. But he says to him, if the Germans bomb England effectively, this could bring peace. The Duke of Windsor seems very much to hope that this would occur. He wants peace at any price. And he also criticizes Churchill and the British government, and the Bermagillo reports to Franco, he throws all the blame on the Jews and the Reds and Eden with his people in the Foreign Office and other politicians, all of whom he would have liked to put up against the war. So I think he's pretty guilty. And if you say that your own country should be bombed, I think that is quite convincingly showing he's guilty. But I was very lucky because I'm married to a Russianist, and he got me another nice quote, because I can't read Russian. I could do the Spanish, but I couldn't do the Russian. And he got me a wonderful quote that he found in the intelligence paper, in the Russian intelligence papers, which also shows how guilty the Duke of Windsor was. And that was a report that came to the Kremlin, a memo saying the former King of England, Edward, together with his wife Simpson, is at present in Madrid, where he is in touch with Hitler. Edward is conducting negotiations with Hitler on the question of the formation of a new English government and the conclusion of peace with Germany, contingent on a military alliance against the USSR.
So there he is, Martin. Bang to rights, I suppose you could say. It's starting to try and form a new government, a fascist government for Britain, even whilst, and it's not really so surprising that they had to whisk Edward VIII away, is it?
No, and of course, this is high politics, unlike Meghan Markle and all the rest of it. This is serious. And of course, the Queen Mother was on the record in the 1930s of being very pro-Hitler. None of that was mentioned at her funeral, was it?
Well, yes, apparently she was very pro-appeasement. But then, of course, when the war actually broke out, the Queen Mum absolutely got behind it. So, you know, the thing is that the difference here is that Edward VIII was on the Nazi side, you know, right the way from the beginning of the war, the build up to the war, and actually during and through the war. That's the big difference. And I think, you know, when war breaks out, one can, you know, you can be excused for, you know, being whatever pro-Nazi in trying to do a deal to stop a war. But once it breaks out, then you can't. Definitely not. But anyway, so after that, that we just heard there, which was the 25th of June, Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor, asking the Nazi ambassador to bomb Britain into the negotiating table. Then we had just literally the next day, on the 26th of June, was the opening shots of the Battle of Britain, which were mine-laying and reconnaissance flights fired by the Luftwaffe, literally the next day. And within about another 3 weeks, the 17th of July, the Luftwaffe started bombing the ports of Britain. The 13th of August 1940 was a big campaign to bomb the airfields, and this was obviously the Battle of Britain going on here. The idea is to try and get air superiority, and if you could take the airfields out, then obviously the British weren't going to get their aircraft into the air. 18th of August, the Duke of Windsor then was then very much removed from the situation, and I do wonder whether the British knew exactly what he'd been saying down in Spain or in Lisbon or wherever he was, and decided that they were going to get him over to the Bahamas. That's 2 months after his statement about bombing Britain to the negotiating table. Then on the 7th of September 1940 was the beginning of the Blitz bombing campaign. Now that led over the period of about 8 months to 42,000 British civilians being killed and 120,000 injured over 8 months. Of course, this does pale into insignificance when you look at the casualties on the Eastern Front, and with the Russians, when they started well, they were betrayed, you know, with the Hitler-Stalin pact being betrayed. On the 24th of November 1940, Bristol city centre was bombed in this campaign. Thank you very much, Edward VIII. And the old Dutch house was destroyed, and Castle Park itself actually used to be a network of roads and lanes. That was burnt to the ground. The only thing that pretty much remains there is St. Peter's Church as a memorial to the Blitz in the Second World War in Castle Park, and also Temple Church, which is on Union Street, or just off Union Street, in between Bristol Bridge and Bristol Temple Meads. That was also burnt out on the 24th of November. 2nd of December, we had Portland Square bombed here in St Paul's. And I'm glad to see that after all this time, finally, whatever it is, 30, many years anyway, later, 130 years or so later, isn't it? 120 years, that actual building that was bombed on the night of the 2nd of December 1940, part of Portland Square here, is being finally rebuilt by some developers who are also building a whole load of student accommodation, which is rather irritating. But anyway, and then on the 11th of May 1941, there was really the end of this battle, with the air superiority being most definitely. I mean, basically, the Luftwaffe had lost and they had to retreat because they were losing so many aircraft in the Blitz bombing campaign. So that was just about a year of bombing that went on as a result of Edward VIII and his encouragement of the Nazis to bomb Britain to the negotiating table, Martin.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Obviously, I don't suppose that the Germans actually, I mean, they were obviously quite happy to have him on side, but it's debatable whether they made their decisions according to his recommendations. And even if they did make his decisions according to his recommendations, I would argue that they were wrong. If the Luftwaffe had concentrated on the RAF bases instead of bombing London and Bristol, etc., they might have won. By switching to bombing civilians in cities, although it was much more destructive and caused more damage, that was, to my mind, a totally strategic error by the Germans.
Well, I mean, you say that, but they did indeed start bombing airfields on the 13th of August. They had a very concerted campaign in 1940, just after all this happened. And let's not forget that these raids started the day after this comment over in Spain, or in Portugal, in Lisbon. But this bombing of airfields, Martin, what happened is the Brits had quite a lot of airfields already built by this point. And what was happening is the Germans were bombing the airfields, and we had prior warning of them coming. So we were getting a lot of aircraft into the air, number one. And number two, what we were doing was we were bringing aircraft back away from their bombing ranges and things like that, so that we just had basically too many airfields and too many facilities for them to bomb. And they realised, I suppose, that if they were just focused on bombing the airfields, that the aircraft were just going to be flying around and going somewhere else, that we were able to get our aircraft in the air so that they wouldn't themselves be destroyed.
Well, that's true. But I still think the idea that by bombing the cities, I mean, don't forget that everybody was terrified of the idea of aerial bombardment of civilian population. And it was thought on both sides that morale would collapse, governments would fall, people would demand peace feelers and so on. We now know, from the bombing of North Vietnam and so on, subsequently, that in actual fact, aerial bombardment very rarely breaks a civilian population's will to resist one way or the other. And of course, what the other thing that they did by doing that is it gave Bomber Harris and the RAF carte blanche to incinerate hundreds of thousands of German civilians on the principle that if you can do it to us, we can do it to you. And of course, what's actually happening here is the degradation of humanity, ultimately ending up in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah, which is another question in itself, isn't it? Because a lot of people have pointed out that those two nuclear bombs never needed really to be dropped. There was no justification for it. That effectively what it was really a live test.
Yes, and of course it was a demonstration to the Russians, who were getting ready to invade Japan. The way it was spun in my childhood was the nuclear bombs stopped us having to invade Japan, which would have been a bloodbath, and we didn't want a bloodbath. They gave in because we bombed Japan, bombed with nuclear weapons. But the Russians had swept through Manchuria, and they were quite prepared to take the casualties to conquer Japan. They'd already taken massive casualties. They were, as Stalin said, we've got loads of people. And if that had happened, of course, the Russians would have ended up in control of Japan. And that's had to be stopped, and that's what that did.
And we have a longer interview with the former Syrian ambassador Peter Ford, which I will put up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk, in which he talks a bit, Martin, about this whole idea of spin, really, where when you want to do something which no one is going to support, it's actually a fairly simple thing to just spin a line. And so long as you don't have any journalists questioning it, this will just go out to the public and at least initially be accepted.
Yeah, well, all wars begin as propaganda. And, the truth is so important, because if people have an erroneous understanding of the way the world works, they can be manipulated. And, of course, obviously what we're trying to do week in, week out with this show is to make people think about what they think they know and to go and check it for themselves. You shouldn't just listen to us talking.
I agree. Yeah, and also whether or not there's a long-term plan by any kind of secret society to control all religions and governments. This sort of thing is a possibility that needs properly examining and looking into, not just simply poo-pooing. The other idea is that I also have a longer version of the interview I did down at Gloucester Road at the eviction. I'll put one of those up, a long version of that if you're interested, and also the long version of the interview with Stanley Laham. I'll copy that up from last week as well. So it's time to sign off now. Thanks to our guest, that's Irish Republican Labour activist Martin Summers. We also heard in the first part from Lib Dem councillor for Knoll, group leader on Bristol City Council, Gary Hopkins, and thanks also to sound engineer Dave Bazanko. since Google and Yahoo manoeuvred me onto their email lists, and then they banned both those lists, either for posts I couldn't moderate or for fake anti-Semitism claims. The only way to be included on my weekly email circulation list, I'm afraid now, is to email me at tony@cultureshop.org.uk. You'll find that address on the contact tab at thisweek.org.uk, and then you'll get an email, hopefully every week, of the show. At least, some of the main links, and if you want to follow up any stories. So if you site or story you'd like to share, you think there's anything that I've missed or have a correction to make, please do reply to that weekly email. To make my own correction here, and that is earlier on I was talking about Archie being Meghan and Harry's daughter rather than his son, which is a pretty appalling mistake. Sorry about that. But anyway, if you have a correction, please do reply to the weekly email or just email me at tony@cultureshop.org.uk, and do feel free to send links or scans or whatever you got. Download our MP3s and you can listen in the car or anywhere you like. You'll find not the BCfm politics shows, podcast, story links, comment page, and our contact details at thisweek.org.uk. This show's repeated at 11 p.m. on Fridays at 11 and 5 a.m. and p.m. all week on the PRSC stream, and over Sunday lunch at campbellisradioquk.com. Thank you very much to Radio Q. Do please make recordings of the stream unless our MP3 platform is down, which it sometimes is at the weekends. Feel free to download and rebroadcast the show anywhere you like, and we'll list you here.
Anyway, it is fantastic to be here in Bristol on this beautiful day. The weather's going to get worse this month, by the way, but make the most of it. And